Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Erin Vanek from The Gifted Perspective. Erin is a teacher of gifted students, as well as a mom of gifted kids, and she is gifted herself. So she absolutely understands this whole world of giftedness, and she shares her information online on her Instagram account, which is at The Gifted Perspective. In this episode, Erin and I discuss the definition of giftedness. We talk about what it is and what it isn't. We especially want to break the myth that giftedness is the same thing as high achievement because they're not the same thing. We also talk about how it is difficult for students to be identified as gifted because there's not one universal accepted definition of giftedness. And so it can vary so much between different states and between different districts. So you really want to make sure that you understand in your state and your district what the requirements are to be identified as gifted and also what those services are going to look like if your child is identified. If you have any questions about this episode or anything that we discuss, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Instagram at Littles Love Learning Blog. And you can also reach out to Erin. She's on Instagram at The Gifted Perspective. Hey, Erin. Welcome to the Littles Love Learning Podcast.
Thank you for this interview. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, I am so excited. As you know, my kids and I love your Instagram. We are obsessed with everything you post. And so I wanted to have you on the show because I feel like there are a lot of parents, especially in my audience of preschool and kindergarten age, who would benefit from this knowledge that you're about to share with us so that they can look at their own child and maybe if they see some signs of giftedness or if they're things that are happening that they're not sure what's going on, maybe your information will give them some better backgrounds. So it's going to be a great conversation, but let's start with your background. Let's go back to the beginning and how you became a teacher of gifted students.
Sure. So I was in the gifted program growing up. I was identified as gifted as a child, and I kind of went through what I think happens to a lot of gifted teenagers, especially when they transition into college, where I started to feel some pressure, like I needed to make a big impact, like I needed to do something really big. And so I thought about law school and I dabbled in that and realized I hated it. And really just kind of floundered my way through college, not knowing what I wanted to do. And then after I graduated college, I just took a random job tutoring just to make some money. And I loved it. Like it just felt right. So I went back and I got my master's in education. And I remembered, like, in my own academic experience, it was my gifted classes where I just felt the most comfortable. And so I wanted to be that teacher for that group of kids. So I also went back and I got my gifted endorsement. And that's kind of how I ended up with teaching. And like I said, and I love it. It is definitely, I'm lucky that I get to do my passion for my career.
That is amazing. And how many years have you been in education now?
Oh gosh, 14. I think we just
Wow.
finished year 14. Yeah. And then
And
I
it's
have 3 children of my own, a 9, 6, and 4-year-old, and the 9-year-old and 6-year-old are identified as gifted and ADHD. So I feel like I'm parenting gifted, I'm teaching gifted, I am living it. It's kind of my whole world.
It is all around you. Well, and I love that you specifically have focused on giftedness because there's so many misconceptions about the term gifted, what it means. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit more about what does gifted mean? And you mentioned that when you were a gifted teenager, you felt this pressure to do something big with your life because we know that giftedness can often get interchanged with high achievement. So if you will just break it down for us super simply, what is giftedness? That would be great.
Absolutely. I actually think I'm going to start by saying what gifted is not and touch on what you just said. So giftedness does not mean achievement. And I think that is a huge misconception. And I think that misconception kind of leads to a lot of the stigma around giftedness. People assume that if you are gifted, you will achieve, whether it's achieving straight A's or whether it's achieving a huge career, you will just kind of surpass everyone else your age. So giftedness does not guarantee achievement. what giftedness is a neurodivergence in your brain. And I know that word neurodiversity has been like a hot vocabulary word recently. And so in the world of giftedness, what that means is that your brain is wired differently. So I like to explain it to my kids where gifted brains are able to kind of make connections in order to learn information quicker than other individuals that are their age. So this might look like someone who's gifted in math. Maybe they can hear a lesson and one time they hear it and bam, they have made that connection in their brain. They get that concept. They're ready to move on. Where maybe some other classmates need to kind of practice that lesson 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, whatever it is. So giftedness is really just the speed in which your brain makes neural connections. And if we were going to even dive a little bit more into the weeds, for another misconception about giftedness is that you don't have to be gifted in everything. So you might have, again, if we're talking about this math stuff, you might have a brain that is gifted in math. And so when you're sitting in math class, again, the lesson is taught and you get it right away. And at the same time, maybe you go into your reading class and you struggle. Maybe you struggle for reading comprehension and understanding vocabulary and remembering that. That's okay. That struggle in reading doesn't negate your giftedness in math. You can be gifted in one area, in multiple areas. Again, it just goes back to how your brain kind of learns information in different areas.
That's so important to understand. Like you said, giftedness and high achievement are not the same thing. Giftedness does not mean you're gifted in all areas. And I know I've seen you post on your Instagram before also that students who are identified as gifted will have usually asynchronous development and also intensities. So I'd love for you to touch on that as well.
Yes, asynchronous development I think is so fascinating. It's the idea, and the first time I read this quotation, I feel like it was a light bulb moment for me. The idea that gifted kids are many ages at one time. So you can have an 8-year-old kid who has the cognitive ability of a 14-year-old, right? And so they're able to kind of understand these concepts, whether it's math, vocabulary, whatever, of a high schooler. And yet maybe they're still throwing tantrums or they're still struggling to tie their shoes. So they have the emotional development of a 6-year-old. And yet they're still an 8-year-old. So maybe they still want to just read the Dog Man books and play Pokemon with their friends. So they kind of have all of these different layers that they're dealing with because again, the gifted brain doesn't just grow evenly. It kind of grows in chunks, right? It's a little bit lumpy. So you might have your cognitive part that's moving really quickly, but your emotional part is kind of lagging behind. And I just think that's important to know with gifted kids. Sometimes when you hear somebody talking to you, again, an 8-year-old talking like a 14-year-old, it makes sense that you would just kind of expect 14-year-old actions and 14-year-old emotional development. And you're like, why are you throwing a tantrum? You just named all the scientific names of dinosaurs. Well, because just because they're cognitively making connections doesn't mean emotionally they're making connections yet.
That makes total sense. I have seen that so many times with students where they get the reading lesson super easily, but they struggle with something like blowing their nose or tying their shoe, something that we would consider quote unquote simple, but they struggle with it. Or a gross motor skill is much more difficult for them, but yet academically or in reading or math, wherever they have that strength, it comes so easily to them. So I think for adults, it can seem really confusing. Why is this not matching up? And so I love that that really is a part of giftedness that we want to be aware of so that we're not looking for this perfect child that is able to be at this higher level in all areas when we see the differences that really could be a marker of giftedness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of teachers who are and parents who are unfamiliar with giftedness, when they kind of hear that label, like, oh, this student is gifted, and then they start seeing maybe some of those big emotional reactions or whatever, they're like, are you sure this kid's really gifted? Because like they can't tie their shoes, they can't cut in a straight line. And so I just love kind of beating down that misconception that yes, you can be gifted and still have struggles in other areas.
Yes. And for any teachers listening, that's so important to notice because I know at the school where my kids attend, the teachers are asked to identify students who should be tested for giftedness. And I think when teachers first start, it's very easy to pick the child who is sitting and listening and understanding the lesson with beautiful handwriting. And they assume this child is gifted, they should be tested. Whereas a veteran teacher knows that that is not what we're looking for with the marker of giftedness. And I have a friend who is a wonderful kindergarten teacher, and she can pinpoint those kids within the first couple of weeks. And it's never the kids that another adult would expect. It's always the kids that you might think, really? They're gifted, but she knows she can see it. She herself is gifted, which I think helps. And she can see it, and they always end up being identified as gifted. And so I think that is important for teachers to understand. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about that, how students get identified as gifted in schools.
Sure. There's no one definition um, that's kind of consistent, right? It's not a diagnosis. So it's not something that would be like in the DSM-5, like autism, ADHD. It is not federally mandated. So I can think of like 15 different good definitions of giftedness from well-known researchers, but they're all a little bit different. So that makes it really tricky. Then when you're talking about identification, IQ is typically used when you're talking about cognitive giftedness. And I do feel like that makes sense because the IQ test does help kind of show these quicker connections. And I often will say that it shouldn't be like the only data point because you do have students who are twice exceptional, which means that they're gifted and ADHD and autistic and dyslexic, who in one IQ test, may not be able to show their true capabilities. So I definitely see the value of using an IQ test. But again, I like to also take in kind of observations, portfolio conversations with those that know the child best. And when we're talking about IQ, kind of back to the idea that there's not a single definition of giftedness, there's actually not a single, like, this is the IQ that you need to check the box of giftedness, which is one of the struggles that I hear from parents a lot because they just want to know, well, what IQ does my kid have to be? Well, there's not like a magic number. So different schools of thought have like 120, starting like mildly gifted, up to like 180 that would be profoundly gifted. But again, without that federal mandate, it also, I would encourage you to talk to your school district, if you're in the United States at least. I know even among school districts, it can be different. Some school districts might say you need a 127, and then you drive to the next school district over and they say you need a 128. So it's frustrating, especially for somebody in the field, because there's no consistency. But I will say all cognitive identification does usually start with some type of IQ testing.
So IQ testing, yes, that makes sense. And I was wondering if there's a certain age that students are tested because in my town, in our district, they're tested in spring of kindergarten year, but in a neighboring district, they're not tested, I think, until second grade. So is it totally different for each district?
Yes. And again, that's kind of set forth, at least in the United States, that's set forth by the states. I know in my home state, there is a law that you have to screen for giftedness twice before sixth grade. So you might have a district that does a screen error in second and fourth grade, another district in first and third. What I like to tell parents, especially parents of like preschool age children that are kind of on that cusp, like, is my child gifted? Are they not gifted? I would suggest waiting to do an IQ test until kind of the conclusion of their, or like towards the middle of their kindergarten year. Just because I feel like part of the IQ test is being comfortable in a testing setting. right? It's a long test, it's different chunks, but it's still a long amount of time for any child to sit. You're with a proctor that you don't know, um, answering all these questions. And I feel like for somebody brand new to academics, like a brand new kindergartner or a preschooler, part of just being in that environment can be tricky. So the child's trying to like just navigate, this is all brand new, let alone trying to then focus on the questions. But I think after they've had like some time in the academic setting, like through their kindergarten year, they're a little bit more comfortable with the process of taking tests and things like that. Um, so that's usually my suggestion, to wait until end of kindergarten or moving on.
That makes sense. And when our school tests for giftedness in the spring of kindergarten year, it's usually with a teacher who the kids have not had a lot of interaction with. So it's a new person and they might not feel so comfortable. And I know some students who are not identified as gifted in kindergarten will then get tested later and be identified. And so it could have just been they weren't comfortable with the testing or didn't have the attention span for it yet. So that makes sense. Do you think parents should reach out to their child's teacher if they suspect their child is gifted and maybe stay in communication about the testing?
I would say absolutely. Um, what I would tell parents, especially, I get a lot of parents that ask me, um, maybe they have like a preschooler who's just looking to start school and they kind of ask, what's the best avenue? Should I go to a public school? Should I go to a charter school? Should I do a school that specializes in giftedness, a private school? And while it's tricky for me to know because it's from all different areas of the country, of the world, my advice is pretty consistent, which is have those conversations early on. So ask the teacher or ask to sit down with the administration of the school and ask them what their gifted services look like. Um, if your child's in a class and you're thinking like, oh, some of this gifted stuff is just kind of ringing really close to home, but the teacher has not reached out to you, I would absolutely recommend sending something to the teacher, because again, as a teacher, I see your kid for 8 hours a day, but I don't get to see them at home. And I've had many parents who say, at school, the kid, like I might say, oh, your child's really quiet. They're not really like participating in these discussions or showing their divergent thinking. And the parents are like, oh my gosh, at home, they're like taking this apart and asking all these questions, which goes back to the idea of not just having one single data point to identify giftedness. So whether it's one single IQ test or one single teacher referral, because giftedness is a holistic thing. So I think letting the teacher know, like, hey, this is something I'm interested in. If you could just let me know what the process is, and I can refer my child for gifted testing.
I love that advice. And it just goes back to advocating for our kids, which we should do if we suspect our child is struggling or if we suspect that they are gifted, just making sure we're on a team with the teacher, with the school, so that those children can get those services they need.
Yeah. And I think most teachers, I like that idea that you said about like the team approach, because teachers, like, we want to be a team. And unfortunately, giftedness is just not covered a lot in kind of your stereotypical like college prep to be a teacher. Like, it's kind of like, if I think about it in the medical field, if I'm a general practitioner, I might not have like specialized understanding of specific medical conditions. So same with teachers. So you can't assume every teacher has a wide breadth of knowledge in giftedness. So they might not be trying to like deliberately keep your child out. They just might not have this understanding, like that giftedness is a neurodivergence and can look different than high achieving. So definitely have that conversation.
100% agree. I don't remember learning about giftedness at
Yeah.
all in my bachelor's program or in my master's program. And it's only now that my two kids are both identified as gifted. My daughter just finished fifth grade, and it's really her as I've been watching her journey. And I will watch the presentations from the district about giftedness. And I will have those light bulb moments like, oh, yes, that I see that at home, that I've learned so much. And then when I found your account, it was like, you were speaking directly to me. And I would read the comments on some of your posts of other parents sharing stories. And I'm like, yep, 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 I can see it. And so it just makes me feel like I am understanding this world so much better than I ever did in my professional training. So it makes total sense that a general ed teacher might not understand giftedness in that way.
Mhm.
I have to share one of the comments someone left on your post said that their daughter got a 0 on a paper because the teacher asked the daughter to write what she learned from the presentation. Well, the daughter didn't learn anything new, so she didn't write anything. And so the mom wrote she got a 0 because she couldn't come up with an idea. And I thought, I know exactly what you're talking about because both of my kids are very much that same way.
Oh, yes. I have had many students that will come to me, like, if I'm doing some type of reflection, and they will say, I haven't really learned anything. And so I love to kind of twist it like, okay, so imagine that you had to teach this to someone else in your grade level who might not have the knowledge that you have. Like, what are 3 facts from that video or from whatever that you think somebody else should have? And then kind of flipping it a little bit and putting them in
Yes.
the driver's seat, then they totally like, oh, I have lots of information to share about that.
Yes. Well, just that wording. Even my son was writing the 10 books that he read this summer. I don't know if you're listening in the United States, but Barnes& and Noble has a really great program where if your child reads 10 books and they write the name of the book and their favorite part, then they get a free book at the end of the summer. So it's their incentive program for reading. He was working on it. He's 6. And he's like, well, I don't know what my favorite part was. My very favorite part. I have to write my favorite part. And I'm trying to tell him, you can just write a part that you liked. And he's like, but it says my favorite. It has to be my favorite. So we worked through it and he picked a funny part, but it's so interesting watching the way their brains work. So my 2 children are identified as gifted. My husband is twice exceptional, gifted, and also has auditory processing disorder. So I live this all the time. I myself am not identified as gifted. So really your account is just helping me understand my family so much better. So I appreciate you in that way. And I would love to know what inspired you to start your Instagram and your business.
Sure. So originally, as a teacher, and maybe this is also kind of that gifted brain in me, I love creating projects. So I will go down rabbit holes and just create all of these kind of immersive projects. It's kind of my bread and butter. And so you might have heard there's a website called like Teachers Pay Teachers where you can kind of post these projects. So it kind of started like that, where I was just really gearing it towards other educators, like, hey, here are some projects I've created for my gifted learners. And then I created an Instagram, again, just to kind of piggyback off that. And then one day I just was really playing around and I just made a reel. There was like a trend going on at the time that was showing like different sides of a type of person that you might not expect to see. And I was like, oh, I should do this for gifted kids. So I just did one showing like what the gifted kid might look like that you might not expect. So the kid with the folder that was exploding of papers, and the kid who doesn't really seem like they're paying attention, and the kid who's maybe not getting all straight A's. And that reel got so much feedback, not just in comments, but I started getting all these messages from people that were just like, oh my gosh, I feel seen. Yes, this is me. And so many people relating that I was like, oh, let me try this again. And so I just kept getting so much, just people that felt validated. And I realized that this was, I guess for me, again, like kind of living it, breathing it, working it, it was something I just assumed. But after seeing all this feedback, I realized, no, people don't really have this understanding of giftedness. So that kind of totally switched my goal. And I was like, my goal is now just to advocate for this type of brain and just to provide resources for teachers, for educators, for gifted adults, so they can have a better understanding of their brain.
That's so awesome. You found that need. And I have heard that before, that things that come easily to us or naturally to us, we assume everybody knows or can do. And that's so not true. And in this case, it is absolutely exactly what you went through. You're like, oh, yes, I know all about giftedness and how to teach gifted kids or parent gifted kids. But for those of us who are not experts at it, we love this information that you're sharing. And you do it in such a fun and entertaining way, too.
Oh, thank you so much. It's fun to do.
And you have webinars, right? So these
Yeah.
are webinars for parents?
Yeah. So I have webinars that I create to kind of target issues that are kind of specific to giftedness, ones that I would get a lot, again, of like direct messages about. So one about giftedness and perfectionism, giftedness and underachievement, giftedness and executive functioning or executive dysfunction, and then just kind of like a basic what what the heck is giftedness? And I talk about kind of the emotional side and the intellectual side and all of that. But yeah, just kind of bite-sized pieces to really zero in on whatever issue you would like to learn more about.
Well, I'll make sure to link to those webinars down below because I think that would be so helpful, especially those listening are most likely preschool or kindergarten parents or teachers. And I think this age is really important to start learning about it now because as your child gets older, you're going to start seeing more and more of these signs. And it will be very helpful to have that understanding to help parent them in a different way. I also wanted to ask because I was watching one of your reels and it was talking about gifted kids can sometimes question or oftentimes question what you are saying and maybe look for loopholes. And as a parent, that can feel super frustrating if they are constantly correcting you or saying actually or looking for that loophole. So, just a quick tip maybe for parents on how to approach that, because I know some parents might find that rude or think their child is being disrespectful when they're doing that. So maybe a little quick tip on how we can think about that differently as parents.
Sure. I would say my biggest tip is try not to take it personally. And I think that just having that outlook in myself as a teacher and as a parent has been life changing. And it's hard, like, right? It depends on kind of the bandwidth that you're dealing with in the moment. There are some moments where my son questions something, or he said, he put all the dishes, I asked him to put the dishes away. And he set them all on the counter instead of putting them where they go. And he was like, well, you didn't say to put them away in the right spot. And I can see where he's coming from. But sometimes I'm like, okay, but this is what I meant. But most of the time, I really try to take a step back and think, okay, was he trying to personally attack me? No, he was really just being curious in his brain. And ultimately, I do want to raise, children, and I want to grow students who are curious and do feel comfortable kind of asking those questions. So I don't want to necessarily shut it down all the time. Um, my kids laugh at me because I often tend to say, "Oh, well, then I guess I misspoke." And I'll say it again. And they're like, "Oh, mom, you're always misspeaking." I'm like, "Yeah, well, I guess I am." So again, it's that idea that I'm not taking it personally. I'm not thinking, oh, he's trying to like pull a power play on me or trying to like cut me down. He's really just totally in his own world, just thinking of it semantically. Um, so I would say that's the biggest thing. And again, I know it's not easy, but just try to remove yourself from the equation.
Not take it personally. That's very good advice, actually. And I appreciate reading all of the comments on your post from other parents because it does feel like a community of parents who are going through this together. And I know you had a post also that was talking about sometimes if you complain or talk about the struggles of parenting a gifted child, it might seem like complaining because how could you complain? You're so lucky that you have a gifted child, that or if you talk about your child's achievements, it can feel braggy, like it can sometimes be a little bit awkward. And so it's nice that you've created this community where parents can feel safe sharing their students' achievements if it is something that they're doing well or something that they're struggling with where they don't have to feel like, "Oh, how dare I complain or vent about this."
Yeah, absolutely. I found like that was again another like common theme that I've heard from my followers, just being thankful for having this community. Because I think parenting a gifted kid can be isolating just for what you said. It's kind of taboo to talk about any struggles. And then if you talk about any positive, it does come across as bragging. And that goes back to the very beginning of just society having this idea that giftedness equals achievement, right? So they think, well, why are you complaining? Your gifted child is going to do all these great things. Um, but again, if we just take away all that emotion, like it's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's just the way that their brain is, um, it takes away some of that stigma, which again is kind of my whole goal to reframe this.
Well, you're doing a great job. If you don't yet follow Erin, go to The Gifted Perspective on Instagram. make sure that you are following her so you can see her posts. It might spark something in you where you see it in your child or even in yourself. I'm sure there are lots of adults that are not identified as gifted, but who are gifted, and maybe they will recognize something in themselves as well. As we're wrapping up our time together, if you could have one big takeaway that you want parents and teachers to get from this episode, what would it be?
My biggest takeaway is don't try to push something on your child. So don't try to necessarily push giftedness on them. And in the same way, if they're identified as gifted, don't try to push any like standards or ideals or any like boxes. Well, then they should be like this or that. Just embrace your kid and embrace their brain and just go along for the ride because it's going to be wild. And I don't know, just enjoy them. I think would be my
Yes.
takeaway.
Accept them for who they are for sure. And I did forget to ask one question. Do you recommend that parents tell their kids that they're gifted if they are identified as gifted? Is that kind of a tricky subject?
Yeah, there's different schools of thought. I do recommend telling kids, and maybe it depends on the age as well. Ultimately, as the parent, like you know your kid, but I also feel like having an understanding of your brain can just be so important. Gifted kids, sometimes people have this again misconception that gifted kids um struggle socially, but they don't know it, right? They're just like the quirky gifted kid and they have no idea how different they are. And I think that's really far from the truth. Lots of gifted kids are very introspective and they're very aware of differences, but they don't always have like the vocabulary to communicate. So they might know like, like in class, everyone else is still working, but I'm done. Like what's that about? So I think just telling the kid like, hey, your brain learns things differently. And there's some things you're going to learn really quickly. There's also going to be times when you're going to struggle, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't mean you're not gifted. It just means that your brain learns differently in those ways. So I do recommend just explaining again based on age level, but that their brain is different and that it's okay.
I love that. That's what we've done with our kids, and it's very helpful. My daughter actually has read a book about gifted kids, and it's nice that she can see herself in that. I think it makes her feel seen and helps her understand herself better. And like you said, they're noticing that there
Yes.
are differences. And so if we don't put words to that difference, it might make them feel weird or like something's wrong with them. So I am in agreement with you on that. Well,
Yeah.
Erin, this has been so much fun. We only have a couple minutes left, but I would love for you to tell everyone where they can find you and connect with you online so that they can learn more about giftedness in their own child and check out all of your webinars.
Yeah. So you can follow me on Instagram at The Gifted Perspective. And then my website is thegiftedperspective.com. And you can find my webinars and other printable resources.
Perfect. I will link to all of that below, and I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been so much fun. Thanks for having me.